In this series of videos, I want to discuss Bible prophecy and the timeline of events that I think will occur in the book of Revelation and how it relates to us today. To illustrate this timeline, I wanted to use this game board, if you will. This is an Axis and Allies game board that I'm using. And I've collected a number of games throughout my time or my life, and I'm using about 5 different games here to illustrate Bible prophecy. And you may disagree with my interpretation of Bible prophecy, and that's okay. You don't have to agree with me. Just sit back and enjoy the video, and if anything, you can try to guess which games I'm using when I bring out all these pieces to show the timeline. So let's get on with it. So Bible prophecy centers around Israel. Israel is the center of the universe, if you will, of Bible prophecy in both the Old and New Testaments. And it's not America, it's not Africa, it's not Europe, it's not Asia, it's not even the Arab states in the Middle East or the Arab peoples, but it is Israel. Israel is the center. And in the center of Israel is the temple. The temple, the Jewish temple in Israel, basically represented God's physical presence on earth. And within the temple itself, they had a place for God called the Holy of Holies. And this is where God would take up residence on earth in the form of the Shekinah glory, as the Bible would call it. The Old Testament would call it the Shekinah glory. Well, something happened, basically. And what happened was that, unfortunately, Israel became unfaithful to God. And her sins basically got so great that God would have to abandon Israel, forsake Israel, as some might say. So what happened was the temple would be destroyed, most unfortunately. And but the Bible describes a certain number of events regarding the temple. And the first time the temple was built was under Solomon, right? And from Solomon, this temple would serve as the civic center of Israel, the civic and religious center of Israel. And but eventually Israel would be conquered by another nation, or another empire, if you will, of antiquity, and that would be Babylon. Right? Actually, it's really the Chaldeans, but we call them Babylonians today. And their capital city was Babylon, right? So what happened was the Babylonians captured Israel, or occupied Israel, around, I think it was like 505 BC. And actually, I think it was 586 BC. And they destroyed the temple. The temple was plundered, and the people of Israel were taken into captivity as a subject slave race back into Babylon, or back into Chaldea. And with them went a person by the name of Daniel. And Daniel was able to interpret a dream by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, in which God showed Daniel why Israel would be punished, or why Israel was being punished, actually. And he said the punishment of Israel would last 7 70s. That is, would last 70 years and 1 week of 7 years each would be appointed unto Israel for probation or punishment. I like to call it probation because, God hasn't totally cursed Israel, but they are definitely being subject to divine correction, if you will. And so 70 weeks of 7 years each has been decreed by God that Israel should be under probation. And what form of punishment would that be? Well, that form of punishment would be occupation by the empires of antiquity. Israel would become a vassal state to the empires of the past, beginning with Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And God showed Daniel an image, a statue, showing basically the probation of Israel, or the punishment of Israel under certain empires. And he showed him a statue that had 5 layers or 5 different metals representing 5 different empires that Israel would be a vassal state to. The first one was, of course, Babylon, Chaldea, which Daniel was now living in. He was living in Babylon at the time. And it was a head of gold on the statue. The chest part was made of silver, and the abdominal was bronze. The legs were iron, and finally God showed Daniel that there would be one empire of 10 toes, made of iron and clay. And so after this, once that Israel would pass through these empires, then God would return, destroy the statue, and establish his kingdom with Israel, as the center of the universe, basically. Well, so what did all this mean? So, the head of gold was Babylon, as shown to Daniel by the angel of God. This is all in Daniel 9. And the chest area of silver would eventually become known as the Persians, the Medo-Persians. And, after each layer of metal is followed by an empire. And so, and we know from history that Babylon eventually was defeated by the Medo-Persians, and that represents the silver part of the statue. And Israel would be a vassal state to each empire that defeated the other empire. So in this case, Israel is a vassal state to Babylon. The Persians would eventually defeat Babylon, and so then Israel become a vassal state to Persia. Persia gets defeated by the Greeks. The Greeks are represented by the bronze of the abdominal area of the statue. And they are a vassal state to the Greeks. Then eventually the legs of the statue of iron is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire defeats the Greeks later on. In each case, in each of these empires, Israel is a vassal state as punishment for their sins against God, as told to Daniel by the angel in Daniel 9. And so, but there's actually one part of the statue that has yet to be fulfilled, and that would be the 10 toes of the feet of the statue. That empire has not arisen yet, or they did not pass through that particular empire. And so what's interesting too, when it comes to temple life, if you will, the temple was first destroyed under the Babylonians. Under the Persians, we find that the temple was dedicated to the Jews, or a rededication, if you will. And then under the Greeks, we find that it was desecrated under the Greeks. And then finally under the Romans, we find that it would eventually be destroyed. In the future, under the 10-toe kingdom of a future empire that is yet to be, we find that the temple will be desecrated. So in all cases of each period of subjugation that Israel must endure as punishment by God. You notice that the temple, something happens to the temple that's significant. Well, going back to the Greeks when they desecrated the temple, let me go back. Let me go back to Babylon. So Babylon was the first empire to destroy the temple. Okay. 70 years later, under the Persians, the Jews are allowed to go back to Israel and rebuild a temple. And that's the dedication of the temple by under the Persians, under Cyrus. Beginning with Cyrus, I believe Artaxerxes Longimanus was the actual ruler of Persia that gave the green light, if you will, to the rebuilding of the entire city of Jerusalem. But what's interesting is that Donald Trump has been compared to a modern-day Persian king who goes by the name of Cyrus. And that's because Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. And so, and then you get to the next empire, the Greeks, when it comes to the temple. Here, under occupation by the Greeks, the temple is desecrated by them. We have a very famous holiday today celebrated by the Jewish people called Hanukkah. And basically, Hanukkah is their 4th of July. This is when they actually rebelled against the Greek occupiers who had desecrated their temple and basically, stopped all sacrifices and so forth that was part of the temple civil service or religious service, I say. And so Hanukkah is a celebration of the victory of the Jewish people over their Greek occupiers. And so that's an interesting aspect of the temple that most people probably don't realize. And then finally, we get to the Roman Empire. The Romans defeat the Greeks, and they become the preeminent power of the Middle East. And Israel becomes a vassal state to them. And what's interesting about this era is that Herod, who is a client king to Rome, adds on to the temple structure and makes the temple more like, according to the specifications of Roman architecture, makes it more like Rome. And so the temple becomes known as Herod's Temple. And eventually, in 70 AD, the Romans famously destroy the Temple of Israel. And so, in each of these cases, though, God is punishing Israel with this probationary period of occupation. And that is because of the sins of the people. So, when the temple was last destroyed in 70 AD, it actually vanished from the face of the earth. And so, since then, there has been no temple in Israel. Israel cannot sacrifice to God like they used to. They can worship God, they have their synagogues, but they don't have their temple. And, this is a requirement for the forgiveness of sins as far as the Jews are concerned. And at some point, the temple does have to come back, because in the book of Revelation, it does describe a future desecration of this temple from the 10-king kingdom, or the 10 toes of the statue that I was talking about earlier under Daniel. And so right now, there is no temple in Israel. But I posit the theory that if the temple was destroyed in the church age in 70 AD, then the temple must be recreated or rebuilt in the church age before any Bible prophecy can begin. And therefore, I believe that the temple will be brought back before tribulation begins. Now, what is tribulation? What is tribulation? Well, God decreed that Israel owes God 70 years of probation, or 70 weeks, 70 weeks of 7 years each day being a year, so 7 times 7 is 490 years. It's a very long probation. And once Israel passes through that probation, then God forgives them, and they are made the center of the universe, basically, center of earth. Well, by the time Jesus Christ arrived on the scene in the time of Julius Caesar, only 69 weeks had Israel passed through this probation. Okay, this probation started when the decree to rebuild Jerusalem was made evident in 445 BC. And so